When I first heard that Peter Stormare was going to be in a movie with Maisie Williams from Game of Thrones, I actually got kind of excited. And when I heard it was going to be this supposedly hardcore survival flick set in with kind of an African desert backdrop, I was I was fairly on board with it. Upon watching the movie, however, which came out on demand and in limited release last Friday, I realized that my excitement could have been better spent on other movies, on much better movies. Now, let me preface this by saying that if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score of this movie, which is called Heatstroke, then you will see that it has a whopping 0%. Now, I don't really think this is an entirely reliable score, considering A, there's only a handful of people who have reviewed this movie, since it is a lower profile movie, and B, I think I think there's a little bit of a misconception when it comes to the quality of certain movies like this. Certain movies that really rely more heavily than others on convention and cliche. This is not what I would consider a 0% movie. Don't get me wrong, it's a really bad movie. And, which is a shame considering the obvious potential that it had and the obvious talent of the people involved. But when I think of a 0% movie, I think of something like Movie 43 or the Seltzerberg movies or The Legend of Hercules. All of which technically have better Rotten Tomato scores than this movie. I really didn't like this movie, but it did not piss me off as those other ones. Or piss me off as much as those other ones. So really, I had about the same reaction watching this as I did watching Paranoia from last year. Is in that it's just a tired old plot with completely stock characters, a completely recycled premise, and a story that you can predict every step of the way. And it's pretty boring. This is probably one of the most boring movies I've seen all year because of that. It focuses on this it focuses on this guy named Paul who makes a living studying hyenas in the African desert. He has divorced from his wife, although he is still trying to stay in the life of his teenage daughter Jo, played by Maisie Williams. Paul himself being played by Stephen Dorff. And while at the same time he's trying to form this relationship, and he is trying to get his daughter to bond with the new woman in his life, Tally, who is played by Svetlana Metkina. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. A Russian woman who respects the fact that Paul obviously puts his work as a big priority in his life. So yeah, that's the basic premise of the movie. Or at least in terms of the characters. Soon, however, upon bringing Jo and Tally with him on a trip to Africa, one of his many trips to Africa, they run afoul of poachers led by some guy played by Peter Stormare. And the rest of the movie, after Paul is unfortunately killed because he saw too much of these poachers' operation, these poachers' ivory collecting operation, Tally and Jo are stranded in the desert, and they have to survive not only the poachers but the hostile environment, which includes snakes, hyenas, the heat, etc. So, looking at this movie, you can probably already guess one of the problems with it is that really they did not need to have quote unquote bad guys in this movie. At this point, I think a lot of people are really starting to grasp the potential for drama in what can be considered a standard survival flick. A lot of people a lot of people really seem to gravitate towards that admittedly basic tale with last year's Gravity. Um, Although, to take that one step further, I actually thought one of the best survival movies of last year, and one that I actually had not gotten around to seeing until this year, unfortunately, was All Is Lost with Robert Redford. This movie does not hold a candle to either one of those movies, Gravity or All Is Lost. This movie is just a pitifully standard. Is half the time this movie seems like a pitifully standard Die Hard ripoff or Die Hard story and just happened to be set in Africa, and the other half tries to give us what we would have liked out of this movie, which is just Tally and Joe trying to survive the elements. But at that point, it's a little too late, and at that point, it really just kind of seems uninspired. It feels like they kind of got off early, and at that point, the movie just seems very. It seems like the movie does not really care as much about showing them braving the elements so much as them dodging the bad guys, and that's one of the biggest albatrosses around this entire movie. The acting is not very good, and that is a shame because there is obvious talent here. Stephen Dorff is just painfully bland in his role. He is not the least bit interesting. He doesn't really have much in the way of personality. He is just your standard, typical, nice guy. Your standard guy who wants to have this relationship with his family, but at the same time he's got this commitment to his work, and he just can't get along with his teenage daughter. Blah blah blah. Stephen Dorff does not bring anything new to the table when it comes to this character. Although again, it's not really his fault. Stephen Dorff is not a bad actor, at least not in my opinion. He's just saddled with a completely bland character. And the same can be said for all four of the principal actors in this movie. Maisie Williams, a lot of people have seen and really love on Game of Thrones as Arya Stark. She's one of the most likable characters on that show, to be honest. She's one of the most interesting, if not outright, hey, likable. But here she just plays your standard bratty teenage daughter who is just completely apathetic about her father's work. She just does not understand. She makes no attempt to bond with her dad or her dad's new Russian wife, despite many attempts made to bond with her. She's just a lot of what comes out of her mouth is just stock bratty dialogue. Svetlana Makina, again, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She actually manages to be one of the worst actors, or at least one of the actors who you can tell it's not necessarily the writing that is holding her back, or at least not all the way, because again, her character is still written just as your standard woman who is trying to bond, your standard tough woman from a tough country. Occasionally she breaks into this kind of speech about in Russia, blah blah blah. In Russia we had to do this, or in Haiti I had to do this. But it seems she's an odd choice for your lead in this movie. Is this supposed to be some kind of vehicle for her as an action star? I don't think so, because A, she doesn't really do that much in the way of action, and B, she is by no means, she doesn't really have that action movie presence or persona. At least with someone like Gina Carano or any number of the wrestlers who have been in action movies, you can understand why someone would think they would make a decent action lead, because they're built like an action hero, or like someone who could really beat you up. Here, not so much. She is very, very skinny, and in fact, when she is going on her whole speech about how she's had it very hard in life, I've actually found it kind of hard to believe. And it also doesn't really help that half the time I couldn't really understand what she was saying. It seems like English is like a third or fourth language to her. And again, I am perfectly tolerant about foreign actors pursuing a career in American or English language cinema. But if you're going to have the character speak English, don't actually do something, maybe an ADR or whatever, to make them somewhat easier to understand. And even then, I think this movie fails at that because there are several points where the ADR is just about as obvious with her as it was in Battle for the Planet of the Apes. um, so she's not very good. And lastly, Peter Stormare again they give Peter Stormare this just stock bad guy, one-dimensional character, and I am so sick of seeing Peter Stormare in that caricature. I'm not even going to call it a character or a character archetype. It is a caricature. I mean, whether you take him in the Brothers Grimm or Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters, Peter Stormare is a talented actor. I don't think many people will dispute that. So stop giving him these one-dimensional bad guy roles. Okay, he is clearly better than that. At least in The Last Stand, his kind of more cartoonish performance fit with the tongue-in-cheek nature of the movie. And I hope to God when they finally bring him on as the new Count Vertigo in Arrow, I hope they actually give his character a little bit more depth. Here he is just, again, your standard action movie or standard direct-to-video action movie bad guy, not a lick of any sympathy, not a lick of any depth, just completely shallow in every sense of the word. So these four characters are not the least bit interesting to me. And again, the story is, I was mentioning this before, it is just your standard, it is just a pitifully standard flick. It just relies on convention and cliche as sort of crutches. Because the first half of the movie is just your standard bonding, this family trying to get along, or at least this woman trying to get along with her boyfriend's or her fiance's daughter, with cliche after cliche after cliche. Then after that, it's just your standard woman has to rescue daughter from bad guys because in this very Die Hard scenario. And then the last half hour of the movie is actually the best part now that I think about it, because it does show flashes of what the film was maybe trying to do with having this hardcore survival story in the African desert. Like, for instance, there comes a point when Joe, Maisie Williams' character, gets bitten by a snake. Or not bitten by a scorpion. This little scorpion. So Tally, which every time they called her Tally, this is just me. This is just me nitpicking. Every time they called her Tally, I couldn't help but feel that she sounds exactly like Tally from Mass Effect. But I digress. Tally has to basically get Joe to dry swallow a pill. So moments like that, those gritty, harsh moments that we haven't really seen a whole lot of, or at least not specifically those moments, are really when I started to gather that maybe this movie actually had a clear goal in mind, but along the way they just ditched it to go maybe for what they thought was a wider appeal. Maybe they were trying to appeal to a more general audience, like, hey, this is an action movie. No, it's really not. Honestly, the quality of this movie, how it's shot, really reminds you of one of those direct-to-video action movie sequels, like The Marine 3 Homefront. Or or again, one of those direct-to-video action movie vehicles for wrestlers or bodybuilders. And again, there it kind of made sense, or at least it did on paper. I'm not saying the movies were any good, but it made sense on paper because they were built like a tank. This one, it tries to be two things. It tries to be this kind of diehard in the African desert, and it tries to be this survival flick. Neither of which it does particularly well. It does the survival stuff better than the diehard stuff, but even then, that's not really saying much. And what is with the hyena fetish that this movie seems to have? For some reason, this movie the writers must think that they were being artsy here by comparing the plight of these characters to the instinctual tendencies of hyenas. What was some of the crap that they were saying? The hyenas will do whatever they need to do to survive. Well, first of all, you're in the African desert, so did you really need to rely on hyenas? Because when you do that, you're really making me want to watch The Lion King. In fact, the few times that the hyenas showed up in this movie, I immediately liked them better than I liked anyone else in the movie. Any of the people. I like the hyenas, the animals, better than the people in this movie. Which, not really sure that's a good sign in something like this. But the hyenas, they don't really do anything unique with these hyenas. They don't really do any kind of allegory, or they don't really kind of draw any believable parallels to hyenas' lifestyle or their hunting patterns or whatever. Really, the whole hyena aesthetic that they were going for could have been replaced with any animal, or almost any kind of predatory, or it doesn't even have to be predatory. Almost any animal in the African animal kingdom could have taken the place of the hyenas in this movie. I mean, lions could have been applicable, elephants could have been applicable, because every point they make about the hyenas is, or at least almost every point, is not really anything that's unique to the hyenas. Of course, animals are going to do what they need to do to survive. And the movie contradicts what could have been the movie immediately, right out of the gate, rejects what could have been an interesting parallel had they developed it, which is this apparently misconception that hyenas are scavengers. So they could have used that and kind of tied it in with what the humans have to do to survive. But again, this movie just falls. This movie does not tie in the hyenas credibly with the plight that's going on. So really, the hyenas' presence in this movie feels very arbitrary and in the end, pretty pointless. They don't really do anything in the story. They don't. I'm going in circles here. This movie is not good. It left me completely underwhelmed. Really, there isn't really much of a climax. The movie just kind of fizzles out and dies. There are flashes of what this movie could have been. With the dry swallowing the pill and the hardcore survival tactics that they sometimes have to rely on, and then dealing with the elements, like them dealing with the dust storm. But again, none of these are really gone into in any kind of real detail. So a lot of the time, you make survival in this place. They make survival in this place a lot easier than it probably would be in real life, or at least they make it seem like it. And again, if they hadn't been so preoccupied with including villains in this movie, then they probably would have had more time to really focus on just the pure conflict of surviving in the wild. So they had a few good ideas there, and again, the African desert setting does make for a fresh setting, and the way that it's shot and the way that a lot of the music is sometimes very underplayed, you buy that they really are in this place, and B, it does make for a pretty foreboding and desolate place to be stranded in. So points there, I guess. They make good use of their setting. But everything else in this movie is just completely underwhelming. It is completely run of the mill. It's not quite a 0%, um, but it's nothing special either. I I really can't recommend you watch this um, and expect to get any kind of originality out of this.